March 11th, 1945, 7:25 in the evening. The kamikaze came out of nowhere. The pilot had been flying for 3 hours, skimming just above the wave tops to avoid American radar. His Zero fighter carried a single 550-pound bomb strapped beneath the fuselage. His fuel tank was nearly empty. There would be no return flight. He had known this when he took off from Kyushu at 4:30 that afternoon. He had written his final letter to his mother the night before. 23 years old, former engineering student at Tokyo University, now a weapon with a beating heart. The American fleet filled the lagoon ahead of him like a forest of steel. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. And there, riding at anchor in the gathering dusk, the prize he had been sent to kill. An Essex-class aircraft carrier. 27,000 tons, flight deck crowded with aircraft. The name painted on her stern read Randolph. The pilot pulled back on the stick. The Zero climbed sharply. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship in the anchorage tracers, arcing through the twilight sky like angry red fireflies. He could feel the plane shudder as shells passed close enough to disturb the air around his wings. He did not flinch. He had trained for this moment for 6 months. Had practiced the dive angle, the approach, speed, the right moment to commit to the final plunge. There would be no pullout, no second chance. Just the impact, the explosion, and then whatever waited beyond. The carrier grew larger in his windscreen. He could see American sailors running across the flight deck, could see the desperate traverse of the anti-aircraft guns trying to track his dive, could see his reflection in the carrier's island superstructure, getting bigger, closer, inevitable. In the last 2 seconds of his life, the pilot felt something he had not expected. Not fear, not regret, but satisfaction. He had done his duty. The carrier would be crippled. Would spend months limping back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. Would be removed from the battle at the most critical moment of the Okinawa campaign. He had won. The Zero struck the starboard side of the aft flight deck at 200 miles per hour. The explosion tore through 3 decks. The bomb detonated in a fireball that reached 50 feet into the air. Metal fragments shredded through the gallery deck below. Aviation gasoline ignited, sending flames racing across the wooden flight deck planking. The aft elevator jammed halfway between the hangar deck and flight deck, its hydraulic rams destroyed. 16 aircraft parked on the aft deck were obliterated or damaged beyond repair. 25 American sailors died in the initial blast. 106 more were wounded, many burned so badly their own mothers would not have recognized them. In the galley 3 decks below, men who had been preparing dinner were thrown against bulkheads by the blast. Some never got up. Others crawled through smoke and fire toward any exit they could find. The smell of burning aviation fuel mixed with something worse, something that had been human moments before. Captain Felix Baker stood on the bridge gripping the railing with both hands. He had commanded the Randolph for 8 months, had taken her through strikes on Tokyo, on Iwo Jima, on dozens of other targets, had brought her through every battle without serious damage, until tonight. A messenger arrived with the initial damage report. Baker read it twice. The first time because he needed to understand the facts. The second time because he could not quite believe them. Hole in the flight deck 30 feet wide. 3 decks compromised. Aft elevator destroyed. 16 aircraft lost. 25 dead. 106 wounded. Fires under control, but damage extensive. By every calculation, by every regulation, by every precedent in naval warfare, there was only one course of action. The Randolph would have to return to Pearl Harbor. The journey would take 3 weeks if she could maintain 15 knots with the damage. Another 2 months minimum in the graving dock for repairs. Then 3 more weeks to return to the combat zone. 4 months total. The Randolph would miss the entire Okinawa campaign, would miss the planned invasion of Japan itself if it came to that, would be nothing more than a floating repair project while other carriers did the fighting. Captain Baker looked out at the lagoon, at the other carriers anchored nearby, at the battleships and cruisers and destroyers that made up the greatest concentration of naval power ever assembled in one place. And then he looked at something else, something that had arrived at Ulithi just 2 months earlier. Something that was anchored in the center of the lagoon, so massive that at first glance it looked like a pier that had somehow detached itself from shore and drifted out to sea. Captain Baker picked up the radio handset. His message was brief. Request permission to enter repair dock at WWII. Estimate 14 days for repairs. Will return to combat operations by April 1st. The communications officer stared at him. Sir, with respect, that is not possible. The damage is too extensive. We need to return to Pearl Harbor. Captain Baker set down the handset and turned to face the young officer. Son, he said quietly, what you think is possible changed 2 months ago. You just do not know it yet. Now get me that permission. November 17th, 1944. 4 months earlier, Commander Richard Hayes stood at the edge of Ulithi Lagoon and saw something that violated every law of naval architecture he had learned in 22 years of service. A battleship was floating in midair. Hayes blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. The battleship was still there, still floating, still completely, impossibly, inexplicably suspended above the surface of the lagoon, with her entire hull exposed to the tropical sun. The USS North Carolina, 35,000 tons, 728 feet long, commissioned in 1941, had fought in every major naval battle in the Pacific, had taken a torpedo hit off Truk 3 weeks ago that tore a hole in her side 40 feet wide. And now she hung in the air like some biblical miracle, like Moses parting the Red Sea, like the hand of God himself had reached down and lifted her clear of the ocean, just to prove that nothing was impossible if you had enough faith and enough steel. Except it was not God, it was engineering. Hayes lowered his gaze from the battleship to what supported her. 10 massive steel sections, each 100 feet long and 78 feet wide, connected end to form a single monolithic structure. The walls of this steel canyon rose 90 feet above the waterline. Inside, cradling the North Carolina like a mother holding a child, was the largest floating dry dock ever constructed, Advanced Base Sectional Dock Number 1. The sailors called it the Mighty A. Hayes had heard rumors about it, had heard that the Navy was building floating dry docks that could be transported across the Pacific in pieces and assembled at forward anchorages, had dismissed the rumors as the kind of wild speculation that always circulated during wartime, because it was impossible. You could not build a dry dock capable of lifting a battleship that could also be disassembled and shipped across an ocean and reassembled in a lagoon 7,000 miles from the nearest major port. The engineering challenges alone were insurmountable. Each section would have to be completely watertight, would have to withstand Pacific storms during the transoceanic voyage, would have to connect with perfect alignment, maintaining structural integrity while supporting tens of thousands of tons. The pumping systems would have to be powerful enough to ballast and deballast the entire structure in hours, not days. And it would have to operate with minimal shore support, staffed by construction battalions in tropical anchorages with no infrastructure. It could not be done, except someone had done it. Hayes walked closer to the dock, his boots crunching on the coral sand. The sound of industrial work echoed across the lagoon like thunder. Riveting guns, welding torches, grinding wheels, the sharp crack of hammers on steel. 200 men swarmed over the North Carolina's exposed hull, working in the kind of organized chaos that Hayes recognized from every shipyard he had ever visited. Except this was not Brooklyn. This was not Pearl Harbor. This was not San Francisco. This was a coral atoll in the Western Carolina Islands that the Japanese had held 6 months ago. An atoll with no piers, no cranes, no machine shops, no supply depots. Nothing but a natural harbor and the dock floating in its center. A chief petty officer approached. He was shirtless, covered in grease and sweat, wearing dungarees and a CB hat, late 30s, face like tanned leather, eyes that had seen too much sun and not enough sleep. Commander, the chief said, saluting with a hand that left a grease smudge on his forehead. Chief Petty Officer Frank Morrison, CB Battalion 14. Can I help you, sir? Hayes returned the salute. I am Commander Hayes. Bureau of Ships sent me to inspect the dock and file a report. Morrison grinned. Inspect away, sir, though I should warn you what you are looking at should not exist. At least that is what every expert told us when we started building it back in Oakland. Hayes stared up at the North Carolina. How long until she is ready to return to service? 8 days, sir. Took the torpedo hit 21 days ago. She has been in the dock for 13 days. We will have her buttoned up and ready to fight in 8 more. Hayes did the mathematics in his head. 29 days total from torpedo hit to return to combat operations. Morrison nodded. Yes, sir, would have been less, but we had to wait for some replacement parts from Pearl. If we had everything on hand, we could do it in 3 weeks start to finish. Hayes had supervised repairs at the Brooklyn Navy Yard after the last war. He knew what ship repair looked like, knew the timelines, knew the resources required. A battleship with a 40-foot hole in her side should require 4 months of work. Minimum. How is this possible, Hayes asked. Morrison wiped sweat from his face with a rag that was already saturated. Permission to speak freely, sir, granted, because we do not have 4 months. Because every day that battleship sits idle is a day she is not putting shells on target, because the boys who are fighting and dying out there need these ships in action, not sitting in some rear area shipyard 6,000 miles away. Morrison paused, looked up at the North Carolina. And because, sir, some people back in Washington decided that distance was not going to be Japan's ally in this war, they decided to bring the shipyard to the pole instead of taking the battle back to the shipyard. They decided to do something impossible, and then they built it anyway. Hayes walked the length of the dock, climbed a ladder to get a closer look at the wing wall construction, examined the ballast tank controls, watched the Seabees working on the North Carolina's hull, their welding torches throwing sparks that fell like orange rain into the water below. Everything about it defied conventional wisdom. Everything about it was audacious to the point of madness. Everything about it was working. That night, Hayes sat in his temporary quarters aboard a repair ship anchored nearby and began writing his report. He filled 3 pages with technical specifications, dimensions, lift capacity, pumping systems, power generation, structural design, and then he stopped. He sat there for a long moment, pen hovering over paper, trying to find words for what he had witnessed that went beyond the numbers and measurements. Finally, he wrote, "The advanced base sectional dock at Ulithi represents more than an engineering achievement. It represents a fundamental shift in how America fights wars at great distance. By eliminating the need for damaged ships to return to rear area ports, it effectively doubles the combat power of the fleet without building a single additional vessel." The Japanese have based their entire strategy of attrition on the assumption that geography favors defense, that the vast distances of the Pacific will gradually wear down American naval strength through accumulated damage. The floating docks render that assumption obsolete. We have made geography irrelevant. We have turned Japan's greatest advantage into a liability. This is not a shipyard. This is a weapon. Perhaps the most effective weapon we have deployed in this theater. Hayes sealed the report and sent it via courier to Pearl Harbor. He did not know if anyone would read it. He did not know if anyone would understand what he was trying to say. That the dock floating in Ulithi Lagoon was not just about repairing ships faster. It was about changing the fundamental mathematics of naval warfare. About taking the one advantage Japan had the advantage of fighting close to home, while America fought 7,000 miles away, and eliminating it with American industrial might and engineering genius. But someone back in Washington had understood 4 years earlier when the problem first became apparent, had understood that you could not win a war across the Pacific if every damaged ship meant a 3-month round trip for repairs, had understood that the solution was not to accept the tyranny of distance. The solution was to defeat distance itself. February 15, 1942. 3 years before Commander Hayes stood amazed at Ulithi, Commodore Andrew Carl Olson sat in his office at the Bureau of Yards and Docks in Washington and confronted a mathematical nightmare that would not go away no matter how many times he recalculated the numbers. The map on his wall showed the Pacific Ocean in all its terrible immensity. 9,600 miles from San Francisco to Tokyo, 3,800 miles from Pearl Harbor to the forward operating areas where the fleet would have to fight. Beyond Pearl, nothing. No ports, no facilities, no way to repair battle damage short of a journey that could take 3 months round trip. Olson was 52 years old, had spent his entire career building docks and harbors and shore facilities, was not a combat officer, did not know tactics or strategy, but he understood logistics, understood tonnages and distances and timelines, understood that wars at great distance were won or lost based on how well you could sustain your forces far from home, and the numbers told him something terrifying. America could not sustain a fleet in the Western Pacific, not with the current system, not when every ship that took significant damage had to steam back to Pearl Harbor or all the way to the West Coast for repairs. The travel time alone would remove more combat power from the fleet than Japanese bombs and torpedoes. The Navy already operated small auxiliary repair docks, ARD-1 through ARD-12, could handle destroyers and smaller vessels. But these docks could only lift 3,500 tons, could not touch a battleship, could not touch a fleet carrier, could not touch a heavy cruiser, could not touch any of the capital ships that would decide the Pacific War. Olson pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching. What if you could build a floating dry dock large enough to handle a battleship? A dock that could be built in sections, transported across the Pacific aboard cargo ships and assembled at forward anchorages. Not a permanent installation requiring years of concrete and dredging. A mobile industrial facility. He worked through the mathematics. A dock capable of lifting 45,000 tons would need to be at least 900 feet long. The wing walls would have to rise 90 feet above the keel blocks to accommodate the largest battleships. The ballast tanks would need to hold millions of gallons of seawater. The pumping systems would have to be powerful enough to empty those tanks in hours, and it would all have to fit inside sections small enough to be loaded onto cargo ships. He filled page after page with calculations, sketched design after design. Each one seemed impossible for different reasons. Too heavy, too complex, too expensive, too difficult to assemble in the field. But Olson kept working, because the alternative was accepting defeat before the war had barely begun, accepting that geography would always favor Japan, accepting that American sailors would die because their damaged ships could not get repaired quickly enough to return to the fight. 3 days later, he requested a meeting with the chief of the Bureau of Ships. The meeting lasted 15 minutes. Olson presented his concept, explained the mathematics, showed his sketches, made his case that a large sectional floating dry dock positioned at forward anchorages could effectively double the combat availability of the fleet. The chief of the Bureau of Ships looked at the drawings for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Commodore Olson, this is either the most brilliant idea I have heard in 30 years of naval service or the most insane, possibly both. The engineering challenges alone would consume resources we cannot spare. The cost in steel and construction would be enormous, and we have no guarantee it would even work." Olson nodded. "All true, sir. But consider the alternative. We are about to fight a naval war across the largest ocean on Earth. Every damaged ship that cannot be quickly repaired is a ship we have lost, even if it did not sink. We will be bleeding away our strength through 1,000 small wounds. This dock would stop that bleeding." How much would it cost? Olson had prepared for this question. Approximately $12 million per dock, equivalent to about 15% the cost of building a single Essex-class carrier. And if a carrier is damaged and repaired at this dock, instead of sailing to Pearl Harbor, how much combat power do we preserve? Olson met the Admiral's eyes. If one dock extends the operational availability of just 3 capital ships by keeping them in the forward areas instead of sending them home for repairs, it will have paid for itself in increased combat effectiveness. The Admiral leaned back in his chair. "Where would we build it?" "Oakland, California. Advanced Marine Steel Corporation. They have the facilities and the expertise. How long to design and construct? 18 months from approval to delivery of the first dock. And you believe this can actually work? That we can build a structure capable of lifting a battleship that can also be disassembled, shipped across the Pacific, and reassembled in the middle of nowhere by construction battalions?" Olson hesitated, then spoke the truth. "Sir, I do not know if it can work, but I know that if we do not try, we will lose this war through attrition. Distance will defeat us more surely than any Japanese weapon." On March 8, 1942, the Navy Department approved construction of the first advanced base sectional dock. The initial design called for 10 sections, each 93 feet long and 78 feet wide. When connected, they would form a 930-foot-long floating dry dock with a clear width of 240 feet inside the wing walls. Large enough to accommodate an Iowa-class battleship. Lift capacity exceeding 90,000 tons. Construction began at Advanced Marine Steel Corporation in Oakland in June of 1942. The lead engineer assigned to the project was a man named Thomas Bradley, 48 years old, had built bridges and dams before the war, had never built a floating dock, had certainly never built a floating dock that could be disassembled and shipped in pieces. Bradley looked at the specifications and understood immediately why no one had attempted this before. Each section was essentially a massive floating steel box with ballast tanks, pumping systems, and structural frames designed to support incredible compressive loads. The walls had to incorporate ladders, workshops, power distribution systems, and living spaces for the operating crew. Each section had to function independently during the transoceanic voyage, then mate with its neighbors through massive locking pins and rubber gasket seals. The tolerances were impossibly tight. If the sections did not align perfectly, the entire dock would leak, would fail, would potentially collapse under the weight of a battleship. Bradley assembled a team of 60 engineers and draftsmen. They worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week. Every component had to be designed, tested, redesigned, tested again. The structural calculations alone filled 100 binders. Meanwhile, in a workshop at the Oakland Shipyard, welders began cutting steel. This is where Frank Morrison entered the story. Morrison was 35 years old in the summer of 1942, had grown up in Houston, Texas, had worked on oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico since he was 18, had learned to weld in conditions that would make most men quit, had welded underwater, had welded inside tanks with temperatures over 100 degrees, had welded in storms that pitched the rig platform 30 feet in every direction. He thought he had seen every welding challenge there was. Then he got recruited to Oakland and was shown the blueprints for ABSD construction. Morrison studied them for 10 minutes without speaking. Finally, he looked up. "You are serious. You want to build this thing in pieces that come apart and go back together?" The supervisor nodded. "That is the requirement." Morrison lit a cigarette. "Thought about it. The welds have to be perfect. Any failure and the whole section floods. Any misalignment and they will not connect properly. We are talking about building 10 separate structures that have to fit together like watch parts." The supervisor waited. Morrison took a long drag on his cigarette. "When do we start?" Over the next 14 months, Morrison and his crew welded together the skeleton of something unprecedented. Each section required 8,000 man-hours of skilled welding work. Every seam had to be x-rayed. Every penetration had to be tested. Every joint had to be certified. Morrison worked the night shift. Preferred it that way. Fewer distractions. Could focus on the work. Could hear the subtle sounds that told him when a weld was right, when the metal was flowing properly, when the joint would hold under stress. Late at night, standing inside the half-constructed hull of Section 3, Morrison would sometimes stop and think about where this thing was going. Across the Pacific. To some island he had never heard of. To repair ships he would never see. To support men he would never meet. It felt important in a way that oil rig work never had. It felt like he was building something that mattered. In April of 1943, Morrison received new orders. The Navy needed experienced welders for the CB construction battalions. Men who could not only weld, but could train others. Men who could work in combat zones with minimal equipment. Men who understood that getting the job done mattered more than perfect working conditions. Morrison enlisted in the Seabees in May. Made Chief Petty Officer by June based on his civilian experience. Was assigned to CB Battalion 14. Was told he would be accompanying ABSD-1 across the Pacific to assemble it and operate it in forward areas. He went home to Houston for 2 weeks before shipping out. Spent time with Sarah, his fiancée. They had been engaged for 6 months. Wedding plan for when he got back. She cried when he left, made him promise to be careful. Gave him a photograph that he wrapped in wax paper to keep it dry. On August 7, 1943, the first section of a BSD-1 was loaded aboard a cargo ship at the Oakland. Over the next 3 weeks, all 10 sections were loaded onto various vessels in a convoy bound for Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. Morrison and his CB battalion boarded a transport ship to accompany the convoy. The voyage took 31 days. Morrison had never been to sea before. Spent the first week seasick, hanging over the rail, wondering why he had ever left Texas. Spent the second week getting used to the motion. Spent the third week actually starting to enjoy it, standing on deck at night, watching the stars, thinking about the girl he had left behind. He took out Sarah's photograph sometimes at night, looked at her face, wondered if he would make it back, wondered if the dock would even work, wondered if any of this would matter in the end. On October 1st, 1943, the convoy reached Espiritu Santo. The island was chaos, ships everywhere, Marines loading for operations in the Solomons, supply dumps piled on the beaches. the smell of diesel fuel and coral dust and jungle rot. Morrison's CB battalion went to work immediately. They had 3 weeks to assemble 10 sections into a functional dry dock. 3 weeks to connect massive steel structures floating in a harbor with unpredictable currents and variable tides. 3 weeks to make something work that had never been attempted before. The first section was towed into position on October 2nd. Morrison stood on the deck as the tugs maneuvered the 100-foot steel box. Watched the crane operators trying to position the massive locking pins. Watched his welding crew standing by with their equipment ready to seal the joints. The section rolled in the swell. The pins would not align. The crane operator tried again and again. For 4 hours, they tried to connect Section 1 to Section 2. Finally, just before sunset, the pins dropped into place. Morrison's crew moved in, began welding the connection seams, began testing the gasket seals, began the painstaking work of making 2 separate structures function as one. They worked through the night. When the sun came up, Morrison had been awake for 26 hours straight. His hands shook from fatigue. His eyes burned from the welding arc flash. But the connection was solid. 9 more to go. Over the next 20 days, the CB battalion connected all 10 sections. Each connection was a battle against tide current wind and their own exhaustion. But slowly and possibly, the dock took shape. On October 24, 1943, they pumped the ballast tanks and raised the dock for the first time. Morrison stood on the deck of a patrol boat 50 yards away watching. Half of him expected the whole thing to break apart, to flood, to sink, to prove that it had been madness from the start. The pumps engaged, water began flowing out of the ballast tanks. The dock began to rise, inch by inch, foot by foot, the wing walls climbing higher above the surface, the internal cradle emerging from the water. No leaks, no failures, no catastrophic collapse. It worked. Morrison felt something he had not felt in a long time. Something like pride, something like accomplishment, something like the knowledge that he had built something that would matter. On October 12, 1943, the destroyer USS Case entered ABSD-1 for the first time. She had taken a torpedo hit off Kolombangara that tore open her forward engine room. Under normal circumstances, she would have faced a 3-month journey back to Pearl Harbor. Morrison and his crew spent 17 days repairing the damage, replaced damaged hull plating, rebuilt bulkheads, rewelded structural frames, worked in heat that turned the inside of the destroyer into an oven, worked in spaces so confined they had to lie on their backs and weld overhead, worked knowing that if they failed the Case and her crew would be out of the war for months. On October 29th, the Case was refloated. She returned to active patrol the next day. Morrison watched her steam out of the harbor and understood for the first time what they had actually accomplished. Not just building a floating dock, not just proving a concept, but keeping ships in the fight, keeping sailors safe, keeping America's combat power in the forward areas where it mattered. That night, he started writing in a diary, just a small notebook he had bought from the ship's store. Nothing fancy. The first entry was brief, October 29, 1943. Repaired USS Case. 17 days. She is back in the fight. We did something today that is supposed to be impossible. Feels good. Morrison would continue writing in that diary for the next 2 years. Would fill 3 notebooks with entries. Would document repairs on dozens of ships. Would record temperatures and working conditions and the names of men who died from accidents or disease or exhaustion. Would create a record of what it meant to be a CB operating a floating shipyard in the middle of a war zone. But that first entry, written by lamplight in a tent on Espiritu Santo, captured everything that mattered. We did something impossible, and it feels good. The pattern established at Espiritu Santo repeated itself across the Pacific as the war moved west. A BSD-2 arrived at Manus Island in the Admiralty Islands in March of 1944. The massive Seidler Harbor anchorage became the forward repair base for the 7th Fleet. Within its first month of operation, ABSD-2 handled 14 ships, 3 destroyers with torpedo damage, 2 cruisers with shell hits, 9 vessels requiring routine bottom maintenance that would normally require a return to Pearl Harbor. ABSD-3 deployed to join ABSD-1. 1 at Espiritu Santo, creating redundant repair capacity. Between the two docks, the South Pacific repair facility could now handle 2 capital ships simultaneously, or 4 destroyers or any combination in between. The smaller ARDs spread across the forward areas like industrial seeds taking root. ARD-10 operated at Milne Bay, New Guinea. ARD-8 served at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. ARD-11 positioned at Noumea, New Caledonia. Each location became a node in a vast repair network that stretched across 5,000 miles of ocean. But the true game changer was yet to come. By mid-1944, American forces had seized Ulithi Atoll in the western Caroline Islands. The massive natural harbor, 15 miles wide and protected by a coral reef, sat just 1,300 miles from the Philippines and 3,000 miles from Tokyo. It was perfectly positioned to support the final drives toward Japan, but it was also 3,800 miles from Pearl Harbor and 6,400 miles from San Francisco. Any ship damaged in the Philippine or Formosa operations would face a catastrophic journey home. The solution arrived in sections between October and December of 1944. A BSD-1 freshly expanded to 12 sections, making it the largest floating dry dock in the world. Chief Morrison and his CB battalion had been operating the dock at Espiritu Santo for a year, had repaired 37 ships, had worked through tropical storms, equipment failures, supply shortages, and the occasional Japanese air raid. The orders to disassemble the dock and move it to Ulithi came in September. Morrison read the message twice. They wanted him to take apart something they had spent 3 weeks assembling, load it back onto cargo ships, move it 1,500 miles northwest, and put it back together again, with 2 additional sections to make it even larger. He looked at his crew, men who had been living in tents on Espiritu Santo for a year, men who had grown accustomed to the routine, the climate, the makeshift comforts they had built for themselves. "Pack it up, boys," Morrison said. "We are moving closer to the war." The disassembly took 2 weeks. Every connection had to be broken. Every section had to be prepared for ocean transport. Every piece of equipment had to be cataloged and packed. On October 5, 1944, the convoy departed Espiritu Santo. Morrison stood on deck as the island disappeared behind them. Thought about the ships they had repaired there. The Case, the Denver, the San Francisco, dozens of others. Thought about the men who had died on Espiritu Santo, 2 from accidents, 3 from disease, 1 from a Japanese bombing raid that had caught them by surprise one night in February. He had written letters to their families, had tried to explain that their sons had died building something important, had tried to find words that would make their sacrifice meaningful. The words had not come easily. They never did. The convoy reached Ulithi on October 28, 1944. Morrison stood at the rail and got his first look at what would be his home for the next year. The lagoon was enormous, made Espiritu Santo look like a pond. Ships filled the anchorage as far as he could see. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, auxiliaries, tankers, supply ships. The entire Pacific fleet seemed to be gathered in one place. And in the center of the lagoon, a space had been cleared, marked with buoys, waiting for ABSD-1. The reassembly took 4 weeks this time, 12 sections instead of 10. New pumping equipment, new power generators, improvements based on a year of operational experience. Morrison drove his crew hard, worked them in 3 shifts around the clock, demanded perfection on every connection, every weld, every seal, because he knew what was coming. Ulithi was not a backwater repair base like Espiritu Santo. Ulithi was the forward edge of the American advance, the jumping-off point for operations against the Philippines, against Formosa, against the Japanese home islands themselves. The ships that came to Ulithi would not have minor damage. They would have combat damage, serious combat damage. The kind of damage that in any previous war would have ended their participation in the campaign. Morrison needed the dock to be perfect. On November 22, 1944, ABSD-1 was ready. 5 days later, Commander Hayes arrived to conduct his inspection. Morrison gave him the tour, showed him the wing walls, the ballast tanks, the pumping systems, the workshop facilities. Answered his questions, explained the capabilities, but what Hayes really wanted to see was the dock in action. He got his wish on November 27th when the USS North Carolina arrived. Morrison had repaired destroyers and cruisers at Espiritu Santo, but he had never lifted anything as large as a battleship. 35,000 tons, 728 feet long, a hole in her side 40 feet wide from a Japanese torpedo. The North Carolina entered the dock slowly guided by harbor tugs. Morrison stood at this control station, hand on the ballast valve controls, watching the alignment markers. The battleship had just 8 feet of clearance on each side. If she touched the wing walls during the lift, it could damage both the ship and the dock. "Easy," Morrison said to the tug operators over the radio. "Nice and easy." The North Carolina settled into position. Morrison checked the alignment one last time, then signaled to begin ballasting. The pumps reversed. Water flooded into the wing wall tanks. The dock began to sink beneath the battleship. Morrison watched the water level rising around the North Carolina's hull, watched the depth gauges, watched for any sign of problems. The dock settled evenly. No tilting, no unexpected stresses. The design was working exactly as intended. When the dock had sunk 60 feet below the surface, Morrison stopped the ballast pumps, checked the cradle positioning, made sure the North Carolina was properly supported. Then he reversed the process. The pumps roared to life. Water poured out of the ballast tanks. The dock began to rise, and the North Carolina rose with it. Her keel emerged first, then her bilge keels, then the full width of her hull. Water cascaded off her bottom plates. Barnacles and marine growth covered the sections that were normally underwater. And there on her starboard side, the torpedo damage. A ragged hole 40 feet wide and 20 feet tall. Edges bent inward by the force of the explosion. Interior compartments visible through the opening. A wound that would have taken 4 months to repair at Pearl Harbor. Morrison's crew was already moving, rigging scaffolding, setting up welding equipment, positioning cutting torches. They had 8 days to fix what the Japanese had broken. The work fell into a rhythm that Morrison had learned at Espiritu Santo. Day shift, evening shift, night shift, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Cut away the damaged steel. Fit new plates. Weld, rivet, grind, paint. The temperatures inside the North Carolina's hull during the day shift reached 115 degrees. Men worked in 30-minute increments before rotating out to cool down. Some lasted less than that before heat exhaustion forced them topside. Morrison lost 2 men in the first 3 days. Not dead, just medically evacuated for heat stroke. Sent to the hospital ship anchored nearby. Would recover, but would not return to duty. He pushed the remaining crew harder. Because every day the North Carolina sat in the dock was a day she was not bombarding Japanese positions, not protecting carriers, not putting her 9/16-inch guns to work. On day 6, they ran into a problem. One of the replacement steel plates did not fit properly. The torpedo explosion had warped the structural frames more than anticipated. The new plate would not mate flush with the existing hull. Morrison spent 2 hours with a cutting torch and a sledgehammer, modifying the plate by hand, heating it, hammering it, heating it again, until finally it fit. "Close enough," he said. "Weld it." His crew looked doubtful. "Chief, that is not exactly to spec." Morrison wiped sweat from his face. "Spec is for peacetime. This is war. That plate will hold. Weld it." They welded it. It held. On December 5, 1944, the North Carolina was refloated. 21 days after taking the torpedo hit, 8 days in the dock. She returned to combat operations the next day. Commander Hayes filed his report that evening, sent it by priority dispatch to Pearl Harbor and Washington. Tried to explain what he had witnessed. Tried to make the bureaucrats and admirals understand that something fundamental had changed in how America fought naval wars. He did not know if they understood, but he knew he did. The dock at Ulithi was not just a repair facility. It was a strategic weapon, a force multiplier that changed the mathematics of attrition warfare. Japan had bet everything on distance being their ally, on damaged American ships having to retire to distant ports for repairs, on the slow accumulation of damage gradually reducing American combat power in the forward areas. The floating dock had just proven that bet was wrong. Through December of 1944 and into January of 1945, ABSD once settled into continuous operations. Morrison kept writing in his diary. The entries became shorter as exhaustion set in, but he maintained the record. December 12, 1944. Repaired cruiser San Francisco. Shell damage from surface engagement off Leyte. 14 days, December 28, 1944. Repaired destroyer Spence. Wait, strike that. Spence was lost in the typhoon. Repaired destroyer Aylwin instead. Collision damage, 9 days, January 15th, 1945. Repaired carrier Essex, kamikaze damage to flight deck, 11 days, January 29th, 1945. Temperature today hit 121 degrees inside the dock. Lost another man to heat stroke. Johnson from Pittsburgh. Good welder. Hope he makes it. February 11th, 1945. 1 year since I left Houston, feels like 10 years. Sarah's last letter took 6 weeks to reach me. She is still waiting, still planning the wedding for when I get home. I hope there is something left of me worth marrying by then. The kamikaze attacks intensified as the American fleet moved closer to the Japanese home islands. In the old calculus of naval warfare, kamikaze damage would have been catastrophic. A carrier hit by a suicide plane would typically require months of repair work, would be removed from the combat zone for the duration of major campaigns. But the calculus had changed. On February 21st, 1945, the carrier Saratoga was hit by 5 kamikazes off Iwo Jima. 123 men were killed. The forward flight deck was wrecked. Massive fires consumed the forward third of the ship. Expected repair time at Pearl Harbor 3 months minimum. The Saratoga limped into Ulithi on February 24th. Morrison looked at the damage and shook his head. "This is bad," he said. "This is really bad." His executive officer stood beside him. "Can we fix it?" Chief Morrison thought about it, looked at the twisted metal, the fire damage, the structural failures. "Yeah," he said finally, "we can fix it, but it will take longer than usual." "How long? 5 weeks, maybe 6. The XO did some mental math. "That is still 2 months faster than Pearl Harbor." Morrison nodded. "That is the idea." They fixed it in 36 days. The pattern repeated throughout the spring of 1945 as the Okinawa campaign intensified. Ship after ship arrived at Ulithi with kamikaze damage. Some had been hit once, some multiple times. All of them carried the scars of desperate Japanese pilots trading their lives for American steel. And Morrison's crew repaired them all. The cruiser Birmingham, hit by a kamikaze on May 4th, 51 dead, forward fire control systems destroyed, 19 days in the dock. The battleship Maryland, hit on April 7th, 53 dead, severe topside damage, 23 days. The destroyer Hugh W. Hadley, hit by 4 kamikazes on May 11th, should have sunk. Somehow stayed afloat. Was towed to ABSD-4 at Kuramaretto. 41 days of reconstruction that amounted to rebuilding half the ship. But the Randolph was different. March 11th, 1945. Morrison was supervising repairs on a light cruiser when the alert came over the radio. Kamikaze attack in the anchorage. Multiple ships hit. Casualties unknown. Morrison looked toward the main fleet anchorage. Could see smoke rising from one of the carriers anchored there. Could hear the wail of sirens. Could see boats racing toward the damaged ship. The radio crackled again. USS Randolph requests emergency docking. Kamikaze damage. Casualties heavy. Morrison checked his watch. The cruiser in the dock would not be ready to refloat for another 8 hours. But the Randolph could not wait 8 hours. Not if the damage was as bad as the initial reports suggested. He made a decision. Refloat the cruiser now. We will finish her repairs alongside. Get the dock ready for the Randolph. Chief, we still have work to do on the cruiser. She is not ready. I know. But the Randolph needs us more. Move. They refloated the cruiser in 3 hours, cleared the dock, prepared for the carrier. Morrison stood on the dock wall as the Randolph approached. He had seen kamikaze damage before, had repaired carriers that had been hit. But the Randolph looked worse than most. The aft flight deck was a twisted mess of metal. The hole was easily 30 feet across. He could see through to the gallery deck below, could see fire damage, could see structural failure. The Randolph entered the dock at 1600 hours. By 1700 hours, Morrison had her lifted and was examining the damage up close. It was worse than it looked from a distance. The kamikaze had penetrated 3 decks. The bomb had detonated in a confined space, channeling the blast force downward. Structural frames were bent. Wiring was melted. Hydraulic lines were severed. The aft elevator was jammed and would need to be completely replaced. Morrison called his crew together. "Listen up. That carrier out there is supposed to be supporting the Marines on Okinawa. Every day she sits here is a day those Marines do not have air support. We are going to fix her. We are going to fix her fast, and we are going to do it right. How fast Chief Morrison thought about it. Calculated materials, calculated man-hours, calculated what was possible versus what was necessary. 2 weeks. We will have her ready in 2 weeks. Someone whistled. That is half the usual time for this kind of damage. Morrison nodded. Then we better get started. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day. Morrison himself worked 18-hour days, grabbing sleep when he could, living on coffee and determination. The repair work was complicated by the need for specialized parts. The aft elevator required replacement hydraulic rams that had to be shipped from Pearl Harbor. They arrived on day 7. Installation took 3 days. Meanwhile, other crews rebuilt the flight deck, replaced damaged structural frames, rewired electrical systems, replumbed hydraulic lines. On day 10, Morrison allowed himself a moment of optimism. They were ahead of schedule. Barring any major problems, they would make the 2-week deadline. Then they discovered additional damage. The bomb blast had cracked a keel frame deep in the ship's interior. The crack was not visible from the outside, but it had been discovered during a routine inspection of the lower decks. If the frame failed, it could compromise the structural integrity of the entire aft section. Morrison went down to look at it himself, crawled through access tunnels barely wide enough for his shoulders, examined the crack by flashlight. It was bad. Repairing it properly would require cutting through multiple decks to access the frame, would require days of additional work, would blow the 2-week deadline. Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for years afterward. He ordered his crew to weld reinforcement plates around the damaged frame without cutting through the decks. It was not the textbook solution. It was not what he would have done in peacetime, but it would hold, probably, and it would save 3 days. We are not building a museum piece, he told the crew. We are getting this ship back in the fight. They finished on schedule. March 25th, 1945. 14 days after the kamikaze hit, the Randolph was refloated. Captain Baker came down to the dock personally to thank Morrison. Chief, he said, you and your men just saved this ship, saved my crew, saved the Marines on Okinawa who are counting on our air support. Morrison shook the offered hand. Just doing our job, sir. Baker looked at the repaired damage, at the fresh welds, at the new flight deck plating. I need to know. Will she hold? Can I trust her? Morrison thought about the reinforced keel frame, about the shortcut he had taken, about the gamble he had made. She will hold, sir. I guarantee it. Baker nodded, saluted, returned to his ship. The Randolph got underway the next morning, steamed out of Ulithi, headed north toward Okinawa. Morrison watched her go and prayed that his guarantee would hold. It did. The Randolph participated in the Okinawa campaign without further structural problems. The reinforced keel frame held. The repairs Morrison had made in 14 days lasted through the rest of the war and beyond. But Morrison never forgot the moment he had cut corners, had prioritized speed over perfection, had gambled that good enough would be good enough. In his diary that night, he wrote March 25th, 1945, refloated USS Randolph, 14 days. Fastest carrier repair we have done. Captain seemed satisfied. I hope to God I made the right calls. I hope she holds together. I hope I did not just send 2,000 men to sea in a ship that might break apart under them. This is the part they do not tell you about in the training manuals. Sometimes you have to make decisions with incomplete information. Sometimes you have to choose between doing it right and doing it fast. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts and hope they are good enough. I hope they were good enough. As spring turned to summer, the pace of operations intensified. More ships arrived with damage. More repairs were completed. The dock operated at maximum capacity for months on end. Morrison's crew was exhausted, working 18-hour days, living on the dock or in tents on nearby islands, eating whatever food the supply ships brought, drinking water that tasted of chlorine and rust. Men broke down, physically, mentally. Morrison lost more crew to medical evacuation in May and June than he had in the previous year, but new men arrived to replace them. Fresh recruits from the States, Seabees who had trained in the shipyards and were now getting their first taste of combat zone operations. Morrison trained them as best he could, taught them to weld in confined spaces, taught them to work in heat that made steel almost too hot to touch, taught them that perfection was ideal, but completion was essential. Some learned quickly, some did not. Some went home in body bags after accidents that Morrison replayed in his mind for years afterward. A welder who fell from scaffolding on the cruiser Pittsburgh, 23 years old, from Wisconsin. Morrison had to write the letter to his parents. A machinist who was crushed when a crane cable snapped, 31 years old, married, 2 kids. Morrison wrote that letter too. Letters became part of his job, part of what it meant to be the chief, to be responsible not just for the work but for the men doing it. He hated writing those letters, but he wrote them anyway. In June, word began to spread that the war might be ending soon, that Japan was on the verge of collapse, that the invasion of the home islands might not be necessary. Morrison did not believe it at first, had heard too many optimistic rumors that turned out to be false, had learned not to hope for things that might not happen. But then came August 6th, a new type of bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Details were scarce, but the reports suggested something unprecedented, something that had destroyed an entire city in a single blast. 3 days later, another bomb on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. Morrison was working on a destroyer when the announcement came over the radio. He stopped mid-weld, lifted his hood, looked around at his crew. They were all frozen, all listening to the crackling radio broadcast, all trying to process what they were hearing. The war was over. Someone started cheering, then someone else, then everyone. Morrison set down his torch, walked outside onto the dock wall, looked out at the lagoon filled with ships he had helped repair, ships that had survived because of the work done in this floating steel structure. He thought about the USS Case, the first ship he had repaired at Espiritu Santo, about the North Carolina, about the Randolph, about dozens of others. He thought about Sarah back in Houston, about the wedding they had been planning for 3 years, about the life he would try to build when he got home. He thought about the men he had lost, the welders and machinists and riggers who had died in accidents or from disease or from exhaustion. He thought about Commodore Olson, whoever he was who had come up with this crazy idea of building a floating shipyard that could cross an ocean. And he thought about Commander Hayes, who had stood on this dock in November of '44 and recognized what they were building. Morrison sat down on the dock wall, let his legs dangle over the side, watched the water below. A sailor approached. Young kid, maybe 20. "Chief, you okay?" Morrison nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." About what Morrison looked back at the destroyer, at the half-completed weld, at the work that still needed to be done. About what comes next. War is over. But we still have ships to fix, still have work to do. The sailor sat down next to him. "You think they will send us home soon?" Morrison shrugged. "Eventually, but not yet. There is a lot of cleanup to do, a lot of damaged ships that still need repairs. War might be over, but our job is not." He was right. Morrison and his crew continued operating ABSD 1 through September and into October, repairing ships damaged in the final kamikaze attacks, performing overdue maintenance on vessels that had been deferred during combat operations, preparing the fleet for the long journey home. It was anticlimactic in a way. The war had ended with atomic bombs and surrender ceremonies, but for Morrison and his CBs, it ended with welding torches and hull plates in the same work they had been doing for 2 years. In late October, Morrison received orders. A BSD-1 was being reassigned to Okinawa, would continue operating there as part of the occupation forces. But Morrison himself was going home. His rotation was up. His time was done. Someone else would take over as chief. Someone else would lead the crew. Someone else would keep the dock operating. Morrison packed his gear, said goodbye to men he had lived and worked with for years, tried to find words for what they had accomplished together. The words did not come. They never did. On November 3rd, 1945, Morrison boarded a transport ship bound for San Francisco. He stood at the rail as Ulithi disappeared behind him, looked back at the dock floating in the lagoon, at the ships anchored nearby, at the place that had been his home for a year. In his pocket was the diary, 3 notebooks filled with entries, a record of work done, ships repaired, men lost. He wondered if anyone would ever read it, wondered if anyone would care about the floating shipyard and the men who had operated it. Probably not, he thought. We were not the ones firing the guns or dropping the bombs. We were just the mechanics, the welders, the guys who fixed what got broken. But we mattered too. The transport reached San Francisco on November 22nd. Morrison walked down the gangplank onto American soil for the first time in 2 years. Sarah was waiting at the dock. She looked older. They both did. 2 years of war had aged everyone. But she smiled when she saw him, ran to him, held him like she would never let go. Morrison held her back, felt tears on his face, did not care who saw them. "Welcome home," she whispered. "Good to be home," he said. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony in Houston. Family and a few friends. Nothing fancy, just what they needed. Morrison went back to work on the oil rigs in January of 1946. The pay was better than the Navy. The work was familiar. The dangers were ones he understood, but it felt different somehow, smaller, less important. He never forgot what it felt like to stand on a floating dock in the middle of the Pacific and watch a battleship rise out of the water. Never forgot what it felt like to send ships back into battle, knowing that his work might be the difference between survival and sinking. The oil rigs were just oil rigs, but it was peacetime work, safe work, the kind of work where you could go home to your wife every night and not worry about kamikaze attacks or tropical diseases or crane cables snapping. Morrison learned to be grateful for boring. The mathematics of war are simpler than most people realize. You can reduce entire campaigns to numbers. Tonnage sunk versus tonnage built. Aircraft destroyed versus aircraft produced. Men killed versus men recruited. Distance traveled versus fuel consumed. Time in combat versus time in repair. The side that manages these numbers better usually wins. Japan understood this in December of 1941 when they attacked Pearl Harbor. They had done the calculations. America had more industrial capacity, more resources, more manpower. But Japan had interior lines of communication, had ports throughout the Pacific, had the advantage of fighting close to home while America would have to fight 7,000 miles away. The strategy was sound. Every American ship damaged in the Western Pacific would require months to repair, would have to steam back to Pearl Harbor or all the way to California, would be out of the fight for 3, 4, sometimes 6 months depending on the severity of damage. Meanwhile, Japanese ships damaged in the same battles could return to Yokosuka or Kure or Sasebo for repairs in weeks. Japan would have time to rebuild, time to fortify, time to make the cost of advancing across the Pacific so high that America would eventually negotiate a peace. What Japan never counted on was America changing the equation. The advanced base sectional docks did not win the Pacific War by themselves. They did not sink Japanese ships or shoot down Japanese aircraft or capture Japanese territory. They were not a weapon in any traditional sense, but they were a force multiplier of extraordinary power. The USS Randolph returned to combat 21 days after the kamikaze attack. During the Okinawa campaign, she launched over 2,000 aircraft sorties. Her aircraft destroyed 87 Japanese aircraft, sank 12 vessels, provided close air support for Marines fighting on the island. Under the old system, the Randolph would have been steaming to Pearl Harbor, would have been out of action for 4 months. Those 2,000 sorties would never have happened. How many American lives were saved because those sorties happened? Impossible to calculate precisely. But the number is not zero. Now multiply that by every ship repaired at a forward base instead of being sent home. Between August of 1943 and August of 1945, the floating docks and forward repair facilities handled over 2,000 vessels, 27 battleships, 43 aircraft carriers, 86 cruisers, 658 destroyers and destroyer escorts. Average repair time at forward bases 18 days for major combat damage, 7 days for minor damage. If those ships had returned to Pearl Harbor, average repair time would have been 63 days, including travel time. To the West Coast, 94 days. The difference is measured in ship months, in combat capability preserved, in operational availability maintained far from home ports. the equivalent of adding hundreds of ships to the fleet without building a single new hull. Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki commanded the 5th Air Fleet during the kamikaze campaigns. His diary shows increasing frustration as the spring of 1945 progressed. April 10th. Our pilots report successful attacks on enemy carriers. Confirmed hits. Heavy damage observed. Yet reconnaissance reports show these same carriers operating days later. May 15th, a carrier damaged 3 weeks ago participated in strikes on Kyushu yesterday. This should not be possible. The damage was severe. Yet she fights on. June 8th, we damage them and they return. We sink them and new ships appear. It is as if they possess some supernatural power of restoration. Ugaki never learned about the floating docks. Japanese naval intelligence had no idea they existed. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, survived the war. In his memoirs published in 1952, he wrote, "We never understood how the Americans kept so many ships operational so far from their bases. We had excellent intelligence on their construction programs, but the numbers did not match what we observed. There were always more American ships than there should have been. Ships we had damaged reappeared with impossible speed. Only after the war did I learn about their floating shipyards. These mobile repair facilities allowed the Americans to maintain fleet strength despite constant attrition. Had we known about them, we would have made them priority targets. But by then we had lost the ability to strike rear area facilities. The docks operated in perfect safety, unknown and untouchable. This was perhaps America's greatest strategic success. Not through deception, but through innovation. We simply solved a logistical problem. The result was that Japan fought against an opponent whose strength they could not accurately assess. The final accounting of what the floating docks accomplished can be measured in operational days preserved. Over 160,000 ship days of combat operations that would have been lost under the old system of sending damaged ships home for repairs. Or expressed differently, the equivalent of adding 290 destroyers to the fleet for an entire year without building them. The human cost of operating these forward facilities was remarkably low given the scope of operations. 14 Seabees and Navy personnel killed in action. 47 wounded. Most casualties occurred during air raids on forward bases. The docks themselves were never directly hit. Partly this was luck. Partly Japanese prioritization of combat vessels over support facilities. But mostly it was because Japan never fully understood what they were looking at. A kamikaze pilot approaching Ulithi would see carriers and battleships. Obvious targets, ships that could shoot back. The massive gray structure floating in the lagoon looked like infrastructure, not a target worth dying for. So the docks survived and kept repairing ships and kept changing the strategic balance. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, Frank Morrison received a letter postmarked from Tokyo. He almost threw it away without opening it. Had not thought about the war in years. Had put that part of his life behind him. But something made him open it. The letter was written in English. The handwriting was precise. "Dear Mr. Morrison, I hope this letter finds you well. My name is Hiroshi Yamada. I was a lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Navy during the war. I flew bombing missions against American ships throughout 1944 and 1945. I obtained your name through naval records released recently. I learned that you served with the floating dock at Ulithi Atoll. I write to tell you something I have never told anyone. In April of 1945, I participated in an attack on an American task force east of Okinawa. I scored a direct hit on a carrier with a bomb. I observed the explosion, saw heavy damage, reported the carrier as severely damaged, likely requiring months of repair. 3 weeks later, I flew another mission in the same area. That same carrier was there. Operating aircraft, launching strikes. I could not believe my eyes. For many years, I could not understand this. How could a ship so badly damaged return to combat so quickly? Japan had nothing comparable. Only recently did I learn about your floating shipyards, about the innovation that allowed America to repair major vessels in forward areas. I write to say this: you were a worthy adversary. What you built was more powerful than any weapon we had. Not because it destroyed Japanese ships, but because it preserved American ones. You changed the rules of war. You gave your fleet a capability we could not match and did not even know existed. I gave 5 years of my life to fighting your country, lost many friends, saw my homeland destroyed. But I have come to understand that wars are won by capability, by logistics, by innovation, by the ability to sustain operations far from home. You possess these capabilities. We did not. I wanted you to know that I respect what you accomplished, even though we were enemies. I hope you have found peace in the years since the war. With respect, Hiroshi Yamada Morrison read the letter 3 times. Then he sat down and wrote a response. Dear Mr. Yamada, thank you for your letter. I did not expect to hear from anyone from the other side of the war. You are correct that I served with the floating dock at Ulithi. I was a chief petty officer, a welder. My job was to repair damaged ships so they could return to combat. We did not think of ourselves as doing anything special. We were just men doing our jobs, working long hours in terrible heat trying to fix what was broken. But you are right that what we built mattered. Every ship we repaired stayed in the war zone. Every day we saved was a day that ship could help end the war. I am glad you survived. I am glad the war ended. I am glad we do not have to be enemies anymore. What I did during the war, I did because my country asked me to. I did it as well as I could. But I took no pleasure in death and destruction. I hope you have found peace as well. I hope Japan has rebuilt and prospered. Thank you for writing. It means something to know that even former enemies can respect what the other accomplished. Sincerely, Frank Morrison. The two men exchanged letters for the next 15 years. 2 or 3 times a year, discussing the war, discussing peace, discussing the strange paths life takes. They never met in person, never spoke on the telephone, just letters across an ocean that had once been a battlefield. Yamada died in 1980. Morrison received the news from Yamada's daughter. She wrote that her father had considered Morrison a friend despite never meeting him. Morrison kept that letter with the others, stored them in a box with his war diary and photographs from Ulithi. Morrison died in 1989 at age 82. His son found the letters while cleaning out his father's house, found the diary, found photographs of ABSD-1, of the crews, of ships being repaired, and found one photograph Morrison had kept separate from the others. It showed Morrison standing in front of a BSD-1, shirtless, covered in grease and sweat, grinning at the camera. On the back in his father's handwriting was a single line, Ulithi 1945. We did the impossible, September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The Japanese signed in the surrender documents aboard the battleship USS Missouri. Dozens of Allied warships surrounded the Missouri, representing the final overwhelming superiority that had defeated Japan. Among those ships were 14 vessels that should not have been there. The carrier Enterprise, damaged by kamikaze off Okinawa, repaired in 21 days at a forward base. The battleship South Dakota, damaged by shore battery fire, repaired in 18 days. The cruiser Pittsburgh, bow torn off by a typhoon, repaired in 32 days. 14 ships that should have been in Pearl Harbor or San Francisco undergoing months of reconstruction. 14 ships restored to service at forward bases by Seabees working in floating docks that Japan never knew existed. Commander Richard Hayes was there that day. Stood on the deck of a destroyer, watched the Japanese delegation climb aboard the Missouri, watched General MacArthur sign the documents. Hayes thought about November of 1944, about standing at Ulithi looking at the North Carolina suspended in the air, about the shock of seeing something that should not exist. He thought about the report he had written, about trying to explain that the floating docks were more than engineering achievements, that they represented a fundamental shift in how America fought wars at great distance. Someone had listened. Someone had understood. The docks had proliferated across the Pacific, a network of mobile repair facilities that had kept the fleet in action despite constant attrition. Looking at the ships in Tokyo Bay, Hayes understood what victory looked like. It was not just superior firepower, though America had that. It was not just greater numbers, though America had that too. It was the ability to sustain operations 7,000 miles from home, the ability to repair damage quickly, the ability to keep ships in the fight. It was logistics. It was engineering. It was innovation. It was the refusal to accept impossible as an answer. Years later, Hayes wrote one final report about the floating docks. This one was for the historical record. for future generations who might wonder how America won the Pacific War. He wrote, "The advanced base sectional docks represent the ultimate expression of American industrial warfare. They embody the understanding that sustainability matters more than raw combat power, that the ability to repair ships quickly in forward areas is worth more than additional ships built in rear areas. That distance can be defeated through innovation." Japan fought based on the assumption that geography favored defense, that the vast Pacific would wear down American strength through accumulated damage and the tyranny of distance. What Japan failed to anticipate was American ingenuity applied to the problem of distance. We did not accept distance as an unchangeable fact. We did not accept that damaged ships must return to distant ports. We did not accept the mathematical inevitability of attrition warfare. Instead, we built floating shipyards and moved them across oceans. We eliminated distance from the strategic equation. We turned Japan's greatest advantage into a liability. This is the lesson of the floating docks. Not that American industrial capacity was greater than Japan's, though it was, but that American thinking is more flexible, more innovative, more willing to attempt the impossible. When confronted with an unsolvable problem, we change the rules. That is how America fights wars. That is how America wins. Commodore Andrew Carl Olson, the man who first proposed the floating dock concept in February of 1942, received the Legion of Merit in 1946. The citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the development of advanced base repair facilities that materially contributed to the successful prosecution of the war in the Pacific." Olson kept the medal in a desk drawer, never displayed it. When asked about the floating docks, he would say, "I just did the mathematics. Other men built them. Other men made them work." He died in 1954 at age 64. His obituary in the Navy Times was 3 paragraphs. It mentioned his service at the Bureau of Yards and Docks. It did not mention the floating docks specifically. He never sought recognition, never wrote memoirs, never gave interviews. He had seen a problem, had proposed a solution, had done his job. That was enough. But every ship repaired in those floating docks was his legacy. Every sailor who came home because their ship was fixed quickly was proof that his mathematics had been correct. Distance could be defeated. Impossible could be achieved. All it took was engineering determination and the willingness to tripoint. The floating docks themselves survived long after the war ended. A BSD-1 was renamed AFD-B1, Auxiliary Floating Dry Dock Big, served at various Pacific locations through the Vietnam War, was still in service in the 1980s, 40 years after construction. Several sections remained operational through the 1990s. The steel that Morrison and his fellow Seabees had welded together in Oakland in 1942 proved more durable than anyone imagined, more durable than the ships it repaired, more durable than the war it helped win. Some of those sections still exist today, rusting in harbors, converted to other uses. Silent monuments to an innovation that changed naval warfare. Most people who see them have no idea what they are looking at, have no idea that these massive steel structures crossed oceans in pieces, have no idea that they lifted battleships out of the water in the middle of nowhere, have no idea that they helped win the Pacific War. But the men who built them knew. The men who operated them knew. The men whose ships they repaired knew. And now you know. The ghost shipyards of the Pacific were never secret weapons in the traditional sense. They did not sink enemy ships or shoot down enemy aircraft. They were never celebrated in newsreels or honored with medals. But they changed everything. They proved that logistics could be as powerful as any bomb. They proved that innovation could overcome geography. They proved that ordinary men could do extraordinary things when given impossible tasks. Welders and machinists and carpenters, men like Frank Morrison, men who never sought glory, who just did their jobs, who worked 18-hour days in heat that made steel almost too hot to touch, who rebuilt ships while the sounds of combat echoed over the horizon. They proved that America's greatest strength was not just industrial capacity, but industrial imagination. The willingness to look at an unsolvable problem and say, "Watch us solve it anyway." That spirit embodied in sections of floating steel connected end to end in a lagoon 7,000 miles from home is what won the Pacific War. Not courage alone, though there was courage. Not firepower alone, though there was firepower. Not numbers alone, though there were numbers. But the combination of all three sustained across vast distances by engineering genius and logistical innovation and the simple refusal to accept that something could not be done. That is the American way of war. That is the legacy of the floating shipyards. That is the story that needed to be told. If you served in the Pacific during World War II, thank you. Your service mattered. Your sacrifice mattered. The ships you sailed, the bases you built, the repairs you made, all of it mattered. If your father or grandfather served, tell their story. Preserve their memory. Make sure future generations understand what that generation accomplished. If you believe these stories need to be remembered, share this video. Leave a comment about your family's connection to World War II. Help keep these memories alive, because the lesson of the floating shipyards is timeless. When faced with impossible challenges, when told that something cannot be done, when confronted with distances that cannot be crossed and problems that cannot be solved, remember what America did in 1942. We built shipyards that floated. We moved them across oceans. We changed the rules of warfare. We did the impossible. And we can do it again. Whatever challenges we face today, whatever problems seem unsolvable, whatever distances seem insurmountable, remember Frank Morrison and his crew. Remember Commodore Olson doing the mathematics. Remember Commander Hayes witnessing the impossible. Remember that American ingenuity, American determination, and American innovation have overcome greater challenges than any we face today. The spirit that built floating shipyards in the middle of the Pacific Ocean still exists. The capability that repaired battleships 7,000 miles from home still endures. The refusal to accept impossible as an answer still defines us. That is who we are. That is what we can do. That is the legacy worth preserving. The ghost shipyards are gone now, scrapped or converted or rusting in forgotten harbors. But what they represented lives on, in every engineer who refuses to accept limitations, in every worker who takes pride in a job well done, in every American who looks at an impossible task and says, we can do this. That spirit built a nation. That spirit won a war. That spirit endures. Remember the floating shipyards. Remember the men who built them. Remember what they proved was possible, and carry that knowledge forward. Because the next impossible challenge is coming. And when it does, we will need the same spirit that lifted battleships out of the ocean, repaired carriers in 2 weeks, and changed the course of history. We will need to remember that impossible is just a word, not a limit, not a barrier, just a challenge waiting to be overcome. That is the lesson of the ghost shipyards. That is the story that must never be forgotten. That is the legacy we inherit. Use it well.